Well, so I asked you to join me because, we're revamping our funding efforts. And I've invited quite a few of my friends to talk about Alfreda Cinema. I'm always talking just by myself to an empty void. And, this time I would really love to, help our audience to not only see themselves, in our individual conversations, that I'll be having throughout the month of November. But, also hear from somebody else. So, I'm not the only person convincing everyone.
Listen, I'm honored to be part of the chorus of Alfreda Cinema.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yasmina Price. So I guess we'll just get started with the conversation. You've been a part of Alfreda Cinema from a very early point in our years. You were actually at one of the first screenings at the Metrograph, and you came for the film Georgia,
Yes.
by Stig Borkman.
Yes.
Also written by Maya Angelou and starring Diana Sands.
The one and only.
So, I would just love for you to kind of share with us what was your experience from that. You definitely don't have to worry about my feelings or anything. I don't take it personal at this point.
All I can do is gas you up. So.
You could, or you could be like, that was a shitty choice. But I stick with, as a programmer, I'm firm behind every bad decision, every hit, every miss.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, what it is just loving to share films.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one thing, which I don't know if people who are aware of Alfreda Cinema recently would know, but you were actually part of a really important resource for me moving to New York as someone who was really interested in film and wanted to know where I could find the things I wanted to watch, because you also ran La Critique du Film Noir, which was a newsletter or a kind of index catalog where you listed all the Black films that were playing. So I remember relying on that as a really important resource, and then seeing that there was also Alfreda Cinema pop up as an endeavor entirely dedicated to Black film program was really exciting, because I think I'd been aware of Metrograph or something before it opened, and no shade to their programming, but if you hadn't brought Georgia to that space, I'm not sure that it would have appeared there otherwise. And it wasn't a film that I was at all familiar with. I'm going to be very honest that I don't remember the screening the most sharply, but I do remember your introduction and just how personable and dynamic, and how evident it was even then that this was coming from such a place of devotion to Black film, which I think was something that I was beginning to cultivate for myself. So I think seeing you standing there as a programmer, having done it, was honestly just really exciting.
Thank you. I will say I appreciate that you said that about the introduction. That still stands as a tougher program for me, because that was a film I had not watched previously. It was a film that I couldn't find even online at that point. So sourcing the print actually was such a long process as well. I believe it came from either Switzerland or Sweden. Don't kill me, scans. Don't kill me, yo. But it was either, one of
some northern European country had the print.
Right, they had the print. The print hadn't been to New York since the 70s, and I was so excited to bring it. I was like, well, yeah. And being a Diana Sands fan, I wanted us all to have the opportunity to see something other than The Landlord.
Yes.
Just to really honor her and explore her work deeper.
Yeah.
So that definitely brought out the fans, the stands. And I'm just always glad to have people come out and, in general.
Yeah.
More than 5 is a success. But, that only kind of leads me, I guess, to my next question, which is, I would love for you to kind of share in the importance of, Black art spaces and Black cultural spaces that really center on entertainment. Do you feel like there are many here in New York? Do you feel like that's something that's, sacred for you? How do you embrace these physical spaces when you do enter them?
Absolutely. I think I think just to speak a bit more generally, I think a frustration that I sometimes have with some Black film programming is that it really uses Black cinema either to fulfill some sort of diversity quota or as a sort of decorative addition, but it's really rare that there are either physical spaces, virtual ones, what have you, that are actually really centering Black cinema. Which is why I think that it is so important that Alfreda Cinema have a physical space, because, there's a thing we call film, which is the thing that's projected on the screen. But I think, even just all the efforts that you put into sourcing that print of Georgia shows that there is so much more labor and so much more care and so much more just so much more to the film practice than just the thing on the screen. And I think whether that's, on the production side, and honoring that work and the different facets that it takes, from the filmmakers to people doing preservation and restoration work to when it's being shown, the projectionist, everyone who is working in a cinematic organization, institution, whatever. But to have all of that ultimately be funneled towards, I think something that is also a project of Black autonomy, that is, what it means to own our own things, and not ownership in a hyper-capitalist because we don't want other people to touch it, but because we want to protect it and care for it. And I think something I really respect in you is the archival angle of your work, which is about so much more than finding old objects, but is, a practice of care that a lot of the time is about building trust with individuals, whether it's a filmmaker that's been forgotten and no one has been showing their print, or it's tracking down exactly whatever random archive is holding, the object, and then bringing it to the people who are really enriched by seeing it. And I'm sorry, I do not think that the mission of Black film is to be shown in a white hipster art house cinema. I don't think that its mission is to be shown in an institution or even a gallery, which might be free, but who is comfortable in that space. And if it's not honoring all the different Black communities that live, especially somewhere like New York, then, what is the purpose of the work? And I think you are orienting yourself in, exactly what I would dream for us to have.
Thank you. I mean, it really is a fantasy. I can't even lie. I just want to live a pleasurable life
with some Black film.
Yes. No, it's for me. It's waking up. It's it's breathing it. It's like listening to it. On top of being somebody equally inspired by music. I mean, being in a cocoon of Black genius, Black culture, Black art. It's so interesting how hard it is to source, but it's so warm when you are in the center of it, because identity through visual exchange, through even a listening exchange, for anyone is sort of answering the meaning of life.
Yeah.
In its own small part. Well, you kind of answered a little bit of a caveat to that question, but in your work, because I'm so inspired by your work as a writer, as a programmer, as a someone, of course, benevolent to social media, but equally influential in that space. And seeing your growth, even coming from that Georgia, to very soon to be collecting your degree from Yale.
We're hoping.
In film studies, and we were kind of talking a little earlier about entering a space where this percentage was brought to me by the wonderful Terry Francis. Entering into a film scholarship space made of less than 3% Black people, Black women. I would love for you to kind of talk to what entering that, feels like, looks like. I mean, is this something that could affect, I guess, other emerging just generations who could, who might also possibly want to look towards getting that additional, getting the higher knowledge in film.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm so glad that you pointed to that kind of generational angle, because I think that's at the core of a lot of how I think about being a film scholar, or approaching cinema in part from an academic angle, which is that I have found academic scholarship in film to be useful in a lot of ways, to be illuminating in a lot of ways, but I think something that was quite clear for me walking into the academy, and I think having been fortunate enough to have a little bit of experience working in the rep office of a film, working in a distribution company, all of them, smaller endeavors, but was seeing how much of film knowledge, which is housed in the academy, or which gets called scholarship, how much it relies on this entire ecosystem, and you forgive me if I'm repeating myself a little bit, but just how much it is a shared collective endeavor that people have vastly different entry points to. And I think in part because of that sort of incredible 3% of Black women film scholars number, was I realized pretty quickly that a lot of what I would be learning would not be from formal film scholarship, but would be, learning from people like you, other people who are film workers of various sorts. But I think seeing how much of the knowledge just isn't there in the books and isn't there in the academy, I think in part because there does tend to be a sense that that's a particular form of knowledge which is separate from other things. But of course it's not, because if there aren't programmers on the ground who are aware of, XYZ quote unquote forgotten filmmaker, and I think a lot of the times forgotten just means that they haven't received a particular kind of institutional acknowledgement. It's not necessarily that they're entirely forgotten, but that none of that would be happening if there wasn't all these other forms of work too. So I think if anything, I'm grateful to so far have managed to be positioned somewhat flexibly where, I'm able to be part of this sort of shared endeavor that is, exists a bit in the academy, but exists enormously outside of it. And for me, that's ultimately where, that's where my devotion lies, is to the Black film that can never be contained in a single school or...
As a Black woman, curator programmer in New York City's film exhibition community, can you kind of talk a little bit, just share for our audience, what that experience is like? How was it to sort of gain entry into, this sort of secret society? What made you, I guess, initially want to pursue it?
Well, firstly, you're very generous. I've definitely only done one real film program.
Which is virtual. Also going to, is it fair to say now is going to a streaming? Okay. Okay.
But might.
Yeah. Maybe you can find it on, in a place near you somewhere.
Somewhere digitally soon. But I think, I think again for me, knowing that part of my credentials and part of my entry point are coming from, the far more closed circuit of academia, and being very aware that both the film practices that have enriched my own knowledge and experience of film, but I think also what I'm ultimately devoted to is film as a kind of commons, which means, as a point of gathering, which needs to be as open as possible. So if anything, I feel incredibly honored to have been able to do some public-facing programming in, spaces that are relatively speaking accessible. But I would say that the other thing is just realizing how much, you and I owe to the people who came before. Earlier, you were mentioning, we were speaking about people like Michel Mater, who, very sadly recently left us, but I think just being so aware of the amount of work, the ways that, Black women before us have devoted their lives to this film practice, and I think especially people like Michelle Mater, who worked in scholarship, in archival work, in programming, in Black community, in business,
in production.
Yes.
Like, she should have had her own cinema for sure.
Absolutely.
Multiple times over.
Yeah, and really knowing that we're on the shoulders of so many.
Pearl Bowser, Gina Duncan.
Yes. Terry Francis. Yeah, and for someone else who's New York based.
Jacqueline Stewart.
Absolutely.
Samantha Shepard.
Yeah.
Jacqueline Stewart, Raquel Gates. Oh man,
icon.
Yeah, Jacqueline the GOAT for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Shout out to all of them.
Because we wouldn't be doing anything without them. And I think even enlarging the frame a little bit more. Someone like Ashley Clark, who used to work at BAM, now works at Criterion. He was the first person who invited me to introduce a film program at BAM, and that made a massive difference for me because suddenly I went from having no quote-unquote credentials doing anything in that capacity to having something. And I think the real richness of people like him, like the Michelle Maters, is the ways that they make sure to connect us to each other, because I think that the worst that doing Black film work can feel is when it feels like you're doing it in isolation, and so much of the work is finding each other and doing things together and knowing that those collective formations have always been the heart of Black filmmaking and will be its future, if we can have a future for it.
I mean, also just want to drop Jessie Maple.
Yes. Yeah.
Who actually operated a cinema, below in her ground floor Harlem townhouse.
Oh, I didn't know that.
20 West.
Yeah.
And she gives us the opportunity, to really be at the forefront of Black, emerging filmmaking.
Yeah.
Of Black emerging Black filmmakers.
Absolutely.
I should say.
Yeah.
And also being in a position to source and of course free the archives.
Truly. And because the restoration of Losing Ground has just happened, Kathleen Collins, and someone who I only found out about recently, Hortense T. Beveridge, who was the first Black woman to be part of the Union of Film Editors. So again, all to say, it's a long lineage that we're working with. Yeah,
I didn't know that. I thought Madeline Anderson was amongst the first.
I mean, amongst the first, and also Maple. To be fair, I think it's also why it is so important to always look to the history and look to those shared collective efforts. Is that for those of us who have always seen each other, was where that thing of unknown, unseen, voiceless doesn't make sense because we always recognize each other. I think that's also where we need to really abandon even though I just used it, the first Black woman to XYZ, the pioneer, because our investment in these sort of singular individual narratives are always so much poorer than when we look around at the community of Black women working in film, Black people working in film, because that's ultimately what actually made things happen, much more than choosing one person in isolation as the first.
Right.
Whatever.
And then, and despite, already doing the work, I think gaining entry into a largely white dominant, community, because that's really what it is. It's the ability to, survive or, survive as far as financial means in a practice that you hold dearly.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of work for Black artists to come to a place where they could support themselves through the work, because for the most part, the money is where we know where the money is, and what we have as far as what our strength is, as audiences, as Black audiences, is coming together. We have the ability to really act for one another. And I mean, all I can really say is that's what I hope to do, and that's what I'm dreaming to do. It's an honor to even begin collecting any financial support or any real possibility towards opening a space And I will also add that, Black film spaces, and Black ownership has always existed alongside, Hollywood, I would say. There were color only theaters. And then again, like, a lot of Black film spaces often look like church basements.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or a bar,
yeah.
And that's welcomed, I think, within the context of, Black ownership in Black arts, in the Black Arts Society. Of course, also mentioning Linda Good Bryant, whose current exhibit, just above Midtown, is an homage to her former space, which existed just above Midtown Manhattan. Wonderful turn of phrase and naming convention of gallery bars, for sure. So, striving towards something bigger than myself, like just to only add is, of course, walking in the footsteps of the women who came before us.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining me, Yasmina.
My pleasure.
That was such a great end. And the sun is just,
doing what it needs to do.
Yes, for sure. But I would love to encourage our audience to join Yasmina and I actually in next year. We'll be in conversation in January at Film Forum following a screening of Ashes and Embers. So happy to announce that screening, and stick around.
Thank you.
Yeah, I be doing. I be doing my Turner classics.
Listen, on your Jacqueline Stewart shit.
Actually, Elvis Mitchell.
Yeah.
He taught me.